I'd like to welcome everyone to this program of Faith for Today. My name is John Esaias, and I'm a member of the team. This is an unusual year, and certainly it has been an unusual year for Faith for Today. So far this summer, we have had only one program that was in person. When we were allowed to have that, one program, and 25 people attended, and it was a very nice session. However, we then had to cancel worship services and access to our building. So now we did have a speaker who presented at that time in June on Zoom. The rest of us were in the room as we watched him present on Zoom. Now that we're not able to go into the church building at all, today's program is Breaking History, and Faith for Today's 66 years of history. I don't believe we have ever had an entire program done virtually. So I am in my home, our guest speakers are in their homes, and we're going to bring you a wonderful program today, I am sure. The title of this program is A Call to Ministry 2.0. And the reason for this is that for 2.0 is that our church is very fortunate in that 9 pastors who either grew up in Mount Lebanon United Methodist Church and its merged partner church, Brookline UMC, we have had 9 pastors who have entered into the ministry or are in the process of entering into the ministry, and they have been nurtured by the Mount Lebanon Church and or the Brookline Church. And so today, we are going to hear from at this point, 2 of our pastors who have come from our church, as well as later you will hear from David Seitz, who is currently a member of our church and is planning to enter the ministry. And he will be later in the program. So last year, we heard the inspiring stories of Reverend Tim Reichert and our current pastor, Scott Miller. Now, during this program, we will hear the stories of Reverend Aimee Twigg. Aimee, if you'd like, obviously, Aimee, you want to just wave? Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it'll be.
That's right. And also, Reverend Ron Hoellein, okay, is with us. And as I said, later on, we'll hear from David Seitz. So in this segment, we want to welcome Aimee and Ron to Mount Lebanon Church, actually welcome them back in a way. I'm going to begin a little bit of background, and then they're going to share their stories with you. Aimee grew up in the Brookline Church, as did Ron. And in fact, it's interesting to note that Aimee has decided to go back to her roots, and she is required to belong to a charge conference, and she selected Mount Lebanon Church as her home base and her charge conference. And it's also where she sends her financial contribution. So Aimee, we appreciate your support of your, I don't know if this is called a church-in-law or how this works.
That's a great term. I think you ought to keep that going. I like that.
Okay, all righty. Since you were involved with the Brookline Church, obviously, before it merged. And so Ron is also from the Brookline Church. Before it merged, I think you were all the way through the church before it merged, right? Ron, you were already in ministry, I believe.
I was long gone, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We were both gone.
So what I would like you both to do, and I'm going to begin with Aimee, is that if Aimee, in your background, would you talk to us about your years in Brookline Church? And what was it like attending at that time? How did those people and those pastors nurture you in your faith? That we'll get to your direct call later in life, but in your early years, how was Brookline influential in your life?
I was not a part of Brookline as long as Ron was. I actually moved to Brookline in 10th grade. However, the impact of the Brookline Church was momentous, really, in my life. And I think that when I think of Brookline, I think of the kind of congregation that was an encourager of those of us who were feeling called and needed to test that and needed to try that out. I remember teaching Sunday school. I especially remember, I had long hair, and I especially remember the Sunday that I caught my hair on fire, but I got that out right away. So little chuckle there. And I think then I got to work with the younger youth, and we did a Christmas play or whatever. And those kinds of things gave me an opportunity to try my wings in ministry in a lot of different ways. I also can remember first playing my guitar at Brookline Church to provide special music one Sunday. And I was in the choir, so the choir at Brookline was a real, talk about small group ministry, you know, people join small groups in order to stay connected to a congregation. And it's true that that's what happens. When Nancy Brown was the choir director, and she was excellent, her husband was studying in the Presbyterian ministry, and she led our choir during that time, and she was excellent. And the choir became truly a part of my family. And then Betty Meyer also, when she played there, she was the one who played and directed the choir for a time. And when Augie and I got married at Brookline, she played for our wedding. So those kinds of things are an encouragement. You know, I can name the Milt Griffin family, the Great Houses, the Hutchinsons, the Schaefers, Jim and Carol Lynn, the Trimbles, the Merchants. My father, as it turned out, worked in the same office as, is it Bill Merchant? Bill and Bunny, wasn't it? As Bill Merchant. The Hoelleins, Ron's parents, the Bryants became like grandparents, true grandparents to me. Frank Schaefer. I mean, those are people that had a strong impact on my life in a variety of ways.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So, Ron, you had a longer experience at Brookline, and I'm sure it had a big impact on your life. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, my family moved to Brookline probably when I was 2 or 3 years old, and my roots are always there. My memories are always there. I grew up in a church-centered family with my mom and dad, and we were in church. My brother and I were in church every week. And you can imagine, as an elementary school or a middle school student, that wasn't always a great thing. To get roused up on a Sunday morning and head off to Sunday school and sit through church. But yet at the same time, that consistency provided a tremendous amount of influence and witness. And I'll concur with what Aimee said. I had a great number of Sunday school teachers who would spend time with us, learning the foundational basic elements of the faith. I am not sure they were real skilled in teaching, but they were volunteered and their hearts were in the right place. And those Sunday school teachers were there Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, sometimes putting up with obnoxious kids, but mostly they were there because they cared. I went through youth groups there, at junior high and senior high. And at that point, John Ford was the pastor, and T.R. Thomas was the pastor. And those networks continued to grow and develop. And then when I got to high school, I want to share also that Milt Griffin was one of those guys who was with the high school class Sunday after Sunday, going through Bible, witnessing to his faith. And then I would go to worship, and I would sit with many other kids. I would sit through the hymns and the music and the corporate prayers. And at that point at Brookline Church, when I was growing up, the communion liturgy was 45 minutes long. It was high church. It did everything. And I remember sitting there sometimes not being sure what was being said, but I'd flip through the hymnal. And so I learned my faith through Bible school teachers, through Sunday school teachers, through the hymnal, through preachers. And I probably didn't really want to acknowledge or be even aware of how much that impact had upon me until I went out into the world. And so for me, my sense of call really began with a leaning and an understanding. First, I am called into the faith. I am called to be a disciple. I'm called to be a servant. I didn't have the words then, but I could say now I was called into the priesthood of all believers. But no matter what you did, whether you're a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer or an auto mechanic, you had a ministry. You had a way to live out your faith in whatever the vineyard in which you worked. And so that sort of guided my life. And I also want to mention a great influence in my life and growing up in the church was the role my grandfather played. My grandfather became incapacitated during my ages 8 through about age 13. And he was a man of great faith who died in our home because he was living with a form of muscular dystrophy and ultimately had cancer. And I would listen to baseball games with him because we love baseball together, but I listened to him pray, I listened to him sing, and I saw firsthand his faith experience along with my family and all those people in the life of the community that really shaped my faith and led me to an understanding of what it meant to be a part of the body of Christ.
Okay, great.
Those roots were planted, even though I wasn't aware of it.
Great. So now I'm going to go from your Brookline years into your higher education years, your college and seminary years. And what we'd like to hear, and I'm going to start with you, Ron, is as your sense of call to ministry began developing, you had to plan through your college years and into seminary. And so I'm sure there was a process of all this, of your call and preparation to your first appointment. So could you walk us through that period from college into seminary and your first appointment and ordination and how all that came about in your life?
Yeah, I would have to drop back even before that, John, to my high school years.
Okay.
I had that strong church background, and then I started to work at Beinhauer Funeral Home when I was 15, and I worked there for 2 or 3 years, and full time in the summer, and then a couple days a week while I was at South Hills High School. And one of the things that happened there was I got to watch hundreds of family go through bereavement and grief. Those were the early years of the Vietnam War, and bodies were coming back from Vietnam. I got to see families in trauma and tragedy. I got to see families deal with losing an elder, a parent, and a great-grandparent. And that confrontation with ultimate questions of life and death and grief and loss really had an impact on me. I went to Wesleyan, and not anticipating going into ministry. I went to become a funeral director. And I was a chemistry major. I'm not sure why, but I did. But somewhere along the line, I had a different sense of call, and it had to do with that sense of what is ultimate meaning, what is purpose, where are your roots, how are you grounded, and a lot of that came out of the funeral home experience, as well as other tragedies in my life. My best high school friend died when I was heading off my first day of college. He died in a drowning accident at Conneaut Lake, and I was working at the funeral home, and I was the one that took the call about his death, and so that was the kind of experience I was with a lot. So I went through college, taking a Bible course here and there, doing a religion studies course, changing my major from chemistry to psych, because I thought I would be heading off to a graduate degree in clinical psych. I did some work at Weston State Hospital in Weston, West Virginia, and I thought that would be a good thing. But that's when the call to ministry really crystallized during those middle years of college. But I still couldn't see myself in the pastoral role. My pastoral models were sort of formal, stiff, white shirt kind of guys. And I couldn't see myself in that role. But I thought I would give it a try. So I took a job as a summer youth turn with Ralph Shipley at Scottdale, Pennsylvania. I was hired to be a youth director for 7 churches in the community. And I got to know Ralph, and I got to be shaped by him. Aimee, I lived with Jim and Millie my last summer there. I was there for 3 years. I was there for 3 years. And it was Ralph who really helped me understand the call to ministry in terms of using your gifts and graces and being who you are. And just your whole aura and style and being. And I became much more comfortable. And so right up until the end of my first semester in college, I was still heading to graduate school. And then over that Christmas experience, I was engaged. Joyce and I were going to get married right after school. And I was in a Presbyterian church in Brookline that is now closed. I went with a neighbor of mine. Brookline at that point didn't have an 11 o'clock service. So I went this 11 o'clock service, struggling with that a little bit. The pastor was a friend of mine from high school. His father was, the pastor was a friend of mine in high school. And it was there in that Christmas Eve candlelight singing service that if I had to have a heart strangely warm moment, it was it. Okay. But to just pluck that moment out of all that I have spoken about would be unfair, because it was a process that led me to that moment. And I decided during that last semester that I would go to seminary, and I chose Garrett on the campus of Northwestern in Evanston. I chose that for 2 reasons. One, it had a strong pastoral care complement, and that was my interest in psych. It had a strong sense of community service. It had a strong sense of relation to to community and to people. So I went there. And I can talk a little more about Garrett. Was that the last part of that service?
Yeah, go ahead with through seminary. Yeah.
In seminary, it was an urban setting. It had a strong minority component. It had a lot of Black pastors from the south side of Chicago. It was a worldwide seminary. There were my pastoral colleagues in seminary were from all over the world. There was a strong Latino contingent. It was a very inclusive kind of seminary. And when I was in seminary, I did all the coursework, but I didn't do any field work in a church, which is interesting enough. I grew up my whole life in the church. I was going to spend my life in the church. I took a break from the church. It was the best thing I ever did. I worked in an alcohol rehab unit on Skid Road in Chicago as part of my clinical work and as part of my field work. I worked in 3 inner city hospital emergency rooms as a crisis chaplain. I did a full 2 full complements of what's called clinical pastoral education, where you're a ward chaplain for a hospital in downtown Chicago. And in those situations is where you make people that you probably don't see in church very often. Yet the impact that they had upon me about what it is that I would be as a pastor and what I would preach and how I would care was profound. And so after I attended church when I was at seminary, I just didn't work in one. But those people and those conditions and those situations prepped me to be what I thought was my call, to be a full-time local pastor. I was called to preach. I was called to do pastoral care. I was called to do teaching. I wasn't called to upper level administration in Life with Church, and I was able to maintain that for over 40 years. And so I was just blessed to fulfill that call with those communion of saints that shaped my life from Brookline through college, through seminary, and now continue to do it in my 3 appointments.
Okay, fine. I just wanted you to add, and Aimee will too, is that, okay, after you graduated from seminary, there was, I assume you only wanted to come back to Western Pennsylvania. Is there a story of how you came into the conference and your first appointment, and what was that like?
No, I was always scheduled to come back. I always wanted to come back. I wasn't ready for what I was going to find. When I came back, Bob Seitz called me to say I've got a 2-point parish in rural Appalachia up in the mountains in the coal mining region. I knew nothing about that. So I was so called to serve two small churches that were predominantly coal miners, which was a really grand experience in terms of hearing their faith story and sharing their faith journey. And the poverty level in southwestern Fayette County was immense. The suicide level was way high. The illiteracy was enormous. And coming back from a college town at a Big Ten university, and coming out of Wesleyan, it was a real lifestyle change to move into rural Appalachia. So I had to learn a lot, and fortunately, those patient people in those two churches of Point Marion and Gans just taught me how to be a pastor.
And you learned quickly how the appointment system works in the United Methodist Church. Go where you are sent.
And I'm very unique. I only had 3 appointments in my whole career.
Wow.
I had 8 years in Point Marion Gans, 11 years in Edinburgh, and 22 years at St. Paul's.
Very interesting. Okay.
It was a way to fulfill that call, because for me, doing pastoral ministry was not doing one funeral family, but doing the second and third funeral, or the second or third wedding, or being present during multiple surgeries, and then doing the funeral and being with the family. So I like that continuity. I like that regular ongoing power and presence and witness. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Well, Aimee, we've heard Ron's story, fascinating story there, and I'm sure that yours is just as interesting.
Sorry it took so long, Aimee.
Oh, no, that's fine. I too have to go back to high school, though, because it was, the preaching of those who were in the pulpit, when you've got young people out there listening in the pews or in the choir loft, in my case, there's an impact that's made there or not. And Ron mentioned John Ford and Tom Thomas. My 2 main clergy who were in the pulpit was Tom Thomas and Jim Martin. And I resonated with Tom Thomas's preaching. And there were numerous times that I was at the altar, and I'm sure this is when the call was developing in my life. I didn't realize it. I wasn't headed toward ministry, as you said, Ron. That wasn't my goal early on. I didn't know that's where God would lead. But then when Tom Thomas left and Jim Martin came to Brookline, I began to have a sense of that calling. And Jim and I sat down and talked about that. And Jim was a graduate of Wesley Seminary. And he said, well, let's go down to seminary and see all about it. So he and I went down to Wesley. He drove me down, and he must have been a night person, because I'm not. And I remember I fell asleep early on in the trip, whenever that was. But I found out about Wesley and loved it. And, there in DC, where a lot was going on. So that's where I went. After going to Pitt, I should say, I went to the University of Pittsburgh. My dad was a Pitt grad. And I'm not sure that influenced me, but there were good reasons why I needed to stay kind of close to home. My mom was bipolar, and so there were family issues there that Jim tried to help with. And anyway, so after going to Pitt, I went to Wesley, and the first, during the matriculation there, I forget what they called it. Anyway, I met Augie, and I didn't do the CPE, clinical pastoral education Ron talked about, but I did get a different education, because Augie was the country mouse, I was the city mouse, and I would go back on weekends to Western Pennsylvania and sometimes play my guitar and sing. He was on a circuit, a rural circuit in Indiana County. He and 2 other seminary or local pastor type people covered 6 churches on a 6-church circuit every week. And so I got introduced to that. Well, when Augie and I decided we weren't just friends, we were going to be the best of friends, and we planned our wedding at the end of the first year of seminary, then he was appointed to the Peninsula Conference in Maryland. And after we were married, that was in July 1st, we were married in August, and so I joined him there. We served down there a year, and then we were invited to come back to Western Pennsylvania. Now, the moment we were married, we became an oddity, because at that point, clergy couples were not many. We had Jim and Thelma Mowry in the annual conference, and they were really wonderful people and had really presented a wonderful example of being a clergy couple in ministry. But I remember, Ron, when we were going through the interview process with the Board of Ordained Ministry, and you're interviewed, asked a lot of questions, and I remember, I don't even know who it was, but the one pastor who was in the committee said, well, you'll want to know what honorable location is. And of course, that meant you're a woman, so you're going to want to not do this for long. You're going to want to have a family and step aside and go out and whatever. Well, that he didn't know me, because that's not where I was headed. But Augie and I became that clergy couple, and we served in Maryland. Like I said, a year later, we were brought back to Western Pennsylvania. And when the cabinet said, we have an appointment for you, we still had 3 more years of seminary. We took 4 years. You could do 3 or 4. And we were afraid to say no as a clergy couple, because we didn't know if we told them no at that point, after the first year of seminary, whether there would be an appointment for us in 3 more years when we actually graduated. But our intention was always to come back to Western Pennsylvania. And whenever the cabinet visited Wesley, we always made sure that they knew that. So we came back to seminary, and the interesting, came back to Western Pennsylvania from seminary when we graduated, and we ended up serving the same charge that Augie had been serving when I first met him, and only they added 2 more churches. So there were 8 churches, and there was a local pastor who was a full-time mail carrier, who was the 3rd pastor on the charge. So we served that for a time. Then we went to Tynest and West Hickory. Again, the cabinet didn't know what to do with us. There was equitable salary. If you were a probationary member, there was a bottom line salary you had to receive. And when you were an elder, there was a minimum as well. So they moved us to Tynest and West Hickory, thinking that something would open up nearby, another charge, because Tynest and West Hickory was a 1-pastor situation. We followed John Miller there when he went to go to be director of Olmsted Manor. And the curious thing was, as the rumor mill went around, there was a rumor that they were going to move the pastor of East Hickory. We were at Tynest and West Hickory, and they subsidized our salary. That the pastor at East Hickory, and I forget the other church, but there were 2 churches there. The rumor was that the cabinet was going to push him out, and that was the kind of things that we heard. We heard this, Ron, from the funeral director who heard the news. so that there would be a parish for Augie, 2 points, 2 churches, and a parish for me, 2 churches. Well, that didn't end up happening. They moved us after a very brief time at Tynest and West Hickory. And then we went to the Franklin district, where Augie had 2 churches and I had 3 churches, and we served those. So you can see that the clergy couple were seen as kind of a problem, but now they're seen as a creative way. You can put a clergy couple in, and the church or charge doesn't have to have a parsonage. You only have to have 1 parsonage, and you can put 2 clergy in, wherever. So we served in Franklin district. I had 3 churches on the Sugar Creek charge, and it was from there, after George Bayshore became bishop, and he was brand new, so he started September 1st, and all of a sudden, and I remember he came to the district, and the clergy were out to meet him, so I had met the bishop. Well, not too long after that, and sometime late fall, I guess it was, Augie and I were putting the kids to bed, and the phone rang. I picked it up, and the voice on the other end said, "Hello, Aimee, this is George Bayshore." And I'm thinking, George Bayshore, I know that name. Well, it was Bishop Bayshore, but he said, "This is George Bayshore." And that's when he invited me to come on the cabinet. And so I spent 6 years there as Franklin District Superintendent. And I remember sitting in the office, and I never saw myself as superintendent material. That was not a goal. I was not working towards that career goal. I always saw my ministry as a calling, not a career. I'm sitting in my office as the DS one day, and I get a call from a clergy woman who was a colleague, and she called to ask me what she had to do to become a district superintendent. I didn't have that kind of wisdom for her. I told her, just do the job of being a pastor where you are. That was the best answer I had from her. After I finished my 6 years on the cabinet, I was appointed to the Latrobe Church, and that's when Augie was appointed to the Bethany United Methodist Church in Latrobe, and I was at the downtown church in Latrobe, the first time we served in the same communities together. And we served together that first summer at LUMC. I can remember going into Pittsburgh for people having surgeries, accidents, whatever. And I said, well, Lord, I always went there, and if this is how my congregation's to get to know me, and to know that a woman can do this, because they had told the cabinet they didn't think a woman would work there. Well, I did my job. And Augie was always the one to be more vocal about women needing and wanting and should be in ministry. When another woman asked me, how do you get accepted? You go in and you do your job, just like a man would do. You're the pastor. You serve the people, you love them, you care for them. And then I served the Otterbein United Methodist Church the last 5 years of my ministry, and it's from Otterbein that I retired. Augie, while I was at LUMC in Otterbein, he served that whole time at the Bethany Church in Latrobe. So in 2013, we retired after both serving 40 years of full-time ministry. And it was great, but we like retirement.
Yeah, we're all retired here. We know what that's like. It's great.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, not to be too personal, but I know, Aimee, you had some issues you had to overcome as being a female. I'm curious, from both of your points, how did your families react to you wanting to accept the call into ministry and become ordained to the United Methodist Church? Because the stories I've heard, some families are extremely supportive. Others, they just don't think that's what they want their children to do. So I was just curious how that was with your families.
I'll jump in. My family was very supportive. In fact, my grandfather on my dad's side, my dad's dad, was out of the EUB arm of the church. And John knows this from my bio. On the Sunday that I was born, on May 21st, 1950, my grandfather had been the building committee for a new church that was dedicated that day. And he never lived to see the day. Let's see, I'm trying to remember what the superintendents were called in the EUB church. Presiding elder, I believe it was. And he never saw that day in my life, but he would have been very proud of that.
Great.
And my mom thought it was great.
Good.
If she could have come along and been a pastor too. My mom was bipolar, and so she had an interesting take on many things, but she was very pleased as well, as was my dad.
Early 70s, it was not very common for women to be going into the pastorate at that time. Am I right?
No. Like I said, in high school, that wasn't my first thought. But through high school and in college, that calling developed, and times at the altar made it clear that I was being called.
Ron, how is your family with your call?
You can well imagine, if you both knew my mom. My mom was delighted. My dad was not quite as delighted.
Okay.
That's curious.
He was supportive, but because he thought I could make more money or have another kind of job or that kind of stuff. And I was the first one to go to college out of my family. My mom and dad got caught up in World War II stuff, and their parents were first generation immigrants. So, and that was always, your profession, your career was always important to my dad. After he heard me preach, he said, yeah, that was a good decision. It took him a while. But again, he was never not supportive. He just was a little more reserved.
Great story. Thank you. Well, I'm going to go to the next question. That is, what are your hopes and concerns about the future of the United Methodist Church?
You want to start this time, Ron?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like everybody else, I'm not sure where it's going. I am absolutely Wesleyan to the core, and my understanding of ministry, mission, outreach, biblical interpretation, theology, use of hymns, sacrament, everything. I think there is room for all of us. I think the United Methodist tradition and the Wesleyan umbrella is a big tent, and so it pains me when we split. We potentially split. I truly hope and wish that we can find a way to stay united and recognize that all children born are God's children, and that we find a way to continue to work for full inclusion in terms of racial divisions, in terms of orientation and gender divisions, in terms of economic and educational divisions, that I think that the Wesleyan Church can weather it, and the United Methodist Church can. But I think not everybody believes that. This is a real anxious time for us as to whether it will be a denomination after August of 21. But at the same time, I recognize that there's probably 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 different Wesleyan related denominations that say the same thing. So I am a churchman, and I really hope, wish, and pray that we keep the focus on the gospel, on the teachings of Jesus, and we work toward making sure that for everyone born, there is the assurance of God's grace, forgiveness, and love. From the first time children are aware of it, or adults are aware of it, until the day that they die and enter into the communion of faith, the communion of saints. So,
thank you. Aimee?
I too am very Wesleyan in all the things that Ron played out. I may be more conservative than he is on some issues, but I truly agree that the potential split is such a difficult thing. Jesus prayed for the unity of the church, and I would hope and pray also for us to find a way to move through the divisions that we have. We need truly to love one another, and unfortunately, there are sides to this, and I think that we need to come both sides, if we have to talk about sides, and I guess we do, that we need to turn and get the guidance from God as to where we should go and what we should be about always. And that does mean loving each and every one. And it's a painful thing, a very painful thing. And I pray for the unity of the church and for the love that we need to have for each other, no matter who we are. I've been to a number of general conferences, so I understand how difficult that can be when we come to divisions such as we face. And we need to come before God. I don't like it that one side will up the other, and then it reverses and goes back and forth. There is wisdom that comes from the Lord, and we need to turn there. And I'm not sure we've done that completely. And I'm talking about both sides of major issues that we face. I hate to see the church split, and I cannot imagine being anything but a United Methodist. But I may have to become Anglican if we have nothing else left of who we are. I don't know. it's a painful thing and a prayerful thing that we need to be about, to be sure.
I'm
Thank
sure,
you.
I'm sure you all had the experience of sitting at the keyboard and typing United Methodist. It comes out Untied Methodist.
Yeah. Yes.
That may be a prophetic kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it
We may not be as linked as we think. And, you know,
Yeah.
from General Conference, you recognize that there are affiliated Methodist churches in other parts of the world. There are autonomous Methodist churches. And so we can find a way to solve it.
I know that my great-grandparents in Arkansas in the early 1900s left the Methodist Church because it was too liberal for them. And they joined the Nazarene Church, which was an offshoot of the Methodist Church. Then their children all came back into the Methodist Church, including my father and so forth. So I think this has been historical, the splits and the reunification, and it's an ongoing story, unfortunately.
Yes.
Well, my last question for you two is, do you have words of wisdom for any people out there who are considering United Methodist ministry, ordained ministry, in this changing world that we live in, comparing your call at that point in time versus what's going on now? Do you have any words of wisdom to, doesn't have to be a young person, anybody who is considering full-time ministry?
Go ahead, Amy.
Oh, okay. Well, I do think, I know that I want to underscore the calling that's a part of it. Both Ron and I have talked today about how initially we didn't think that we were going to do what we ended up doing, but there was a call that was present. And I think the presence of the call is foundational to ministry. I was an English major, an English writing major at Pitt, and I guess I thought I was going to write poetry and have cold running water and live in an attic. I do write poetry, and actually I've written some in these recent days about the church. I wrote one for Easter Sunday called Easter 2020, and it's such a difficult time that we're in. But I don't just think, I know that the call of God is so important. And then God will direct, where you're to be. I grew up in the city, but ended up serving rural churches for much of my ministry, and neither Augie or I saw those as stepping stones to greater, bigger, better things. There was ministry to be done in every place we went. And to hone the skills then that God has given for you to be able to use in ministry. And we live in such a diverse time where there's many, many ways to serve, and it's not always traditional pulpit ministry. There's lots of other ways and means to follow a call. Having been a superintendent and a clergy woman, I believe that could cut the path for women to continue to do that in this annual conference. And so we're examples for each other. And I followed the likes of people like Thelma Mowry, and that's important too, to look to those around and to talk with people that you know in ministry as you test your call. It's a great thing. It's a wonderful way to serve. It's a blessing.
Thank you. Ron?
I'll agree with Amy. There needs to be a clarity of call. Somebody told me when I was struggling with this a little bit, he said, if you can do anything else besides ministry, do it. If you can't do anything else, then you must do it. And that's always been sort of a clarion word for me. And I have nothing but gratitude for that clarity of call. And the itinerant system for me was just a remarkable experience. Coming from urban Chicago to Appalachia and coal miners and a high level of poverty. Joyce cried when we saw that parsonage,
Mm.
but after 8 years, she cried when we left. And just about the time I had the hankering for working with poor folks in Appalachia, I was appointed to a college town, thinking I'd have to change my style, where there were 74 PhDs in that congregation. And it turned out that they were brilliant people, but there was a lot of biblical ignorance, a lot of theology. So I changed my style a little bit. And after 11 years of working on campus ministry and a situation I loved, we cried again and moved to a multi-pastoral staff team. And I was never in a church that had a multiple pastoral staff. I remember sitting down, and there were 3.5 pastors, or 4.5 pastors at work at St. Paul's when I was appointed there. And I sat down with them for the first time, and I asked them, "What do you do?" And after they all said what they did, I said, "What do I do?" And I had to learn that, and had to learn all those things. But in each one of those congregations, people helped me to be a pastor. That supportive presence that came from my very roots and that clarity of call was able to see me through. So if I had advice for somebody, it is, there is no, in the United Methodist system, there's no bad appointment, because there are people who need God everywhere. And people need to be loved, supported, affirmed, embraced, proclaimed to, witnessed. And places where I thought it was most impossible were the brightest points in my life. I would encourage them to go to a United Methodist seminary if they're going to serve in a United Methodist church. We have way too many pastors who don't have those Wesleyan roots. And Aimee went to Wesleyan and I went to Garrett, and I've gotten to know other pastors from United Methodist traditions. Those seminary roots are critically important for helping us shape what ministry looks like, and our theology and our capacity to be a pastor in terms of pastoral care and teaching. We just have to do it. I would also encourage them to seek the support of their local congregation. One of the things that Aimee and I didn't get to was Brookline Church supported us in ministry. They prayed for us. They sent minimal amounts of dollars, but it meant a lot. So, and now anybody contemplating ministry needs to really think through the United Methodist Church. Because the future is a little foggy right now. Doesn't mean we won't find clarity, but it's a little foggy, a little fuzzy.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your fascinating stories. As a person who listens to the pastors in the pulpit and has known many pastors, this was fascinating to find the story behind the story and to get to know you two better. And I'm sure that members of the congregation, especially the Brookline people, appreciate the stories that you shared and how they have influenced you. I know that one thing that I've learned as a layperson from both of you is the important role that I have as a church member in encouraging people to enter the ministry. And that, as you have stated, everything we do has an impact in a way that we don't know has an impact, but it does have an impact. And so we need to be cognizant of that. And I'm hoping that those who have listened this morning from our church or wherever they have listened, if they're not members of our church, that you have inspired us to do that in our lives as we walk with Christ through our church, and to be aware of how we can continue supporting future ministers, because we need to have younger and newer people go into ministry to replace the capable people that, like you, who have retired. So again, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity, and it was a wonderful conversation. We are continuing our Faith for Today program entitled A Call to Ministry 2.0. This is our second Faith for Today program that has talked about or introduced men and women who have come from our church, who have entered the full-time ministry or are in the process of doing so. So our next speaker is David Seitz, who is a member of our congregation currently and has quite a different background from our previous speakers, Aimee, Twigg, and Hoellein. David is in the preparation period for ordained ministry. And as he stated to me, this is his 9th career. Usually they talk about second career pastors, but I guess, David, you'll be unique in that you'll be a 9th career pastor. So at this time, David, would you please share with our audience a little personal history and work history that has brought you to this point?
I'm born and raised in Pittsburgh and in the South Hills in the Baldwin-Whitehall area, graduated, and I couldn't wait to leave Pittsburgh. I wanted to breathe clean air, so Beck took me out to the West Coast where I spent most of my adult life. I went to a very small private liberal arts college, Bethany College, 60 miles away. I thought that I wanted to get away from the city. I really did. So unbeknownst to me, of course, I ended up right in the middle of coal country. But anyhow, I was there for a couple of years and then transferred. I had my first social work job when I was 20. I used to work with individuals with severe intellectual disabilities and mental health issues in Duquesne. So I used to take my folks to Kennywood, Hoellein. And then I transferred off to the University of Virginia. I left there in '83. At that time, I got involved with the theater. I was an actor. I worked professionally for many years. What took me up to Wisconsin, which is where I went after I graduated, I wanted to be closer to my family. My mom, who was a member of the church and still is a member of the church, she changed careers, and as a result, it took her from Pittsburgh to Wisconsin. So I moved to Milwaukee, and I was up there for several years, and then I eventually went to graduate school at the University of San Diego in San Diego at the old Experian Theater. And while on the West Coast, I was an actor, but I was also involved with social work, and I felt because of that incredible dynamic between which, let's face it, a lot of it is about ego and putting yourself out there and almost internally crying out to everyone, I am the greatest. But it requires that kind of energy for you to have the nerve to be on stage that these 100 or these 500 or these 1,500 people are going to watch you. You have to feel as if what you're giving is worth their time and they're paying you money to do it. My work was a very, I guess it's called Eastern-based actor. I was an actor that went to a program that really relied on procuring and defining and really perfecting the human voice, that with the voice we tell stories. So there's something it's very theological in a lot of ways too. In the beginning was the Word. Well, my training as an actor very similar. I moved 120 times in 20-some years on the West Coast, mostly anywhere between Seattle and Arizona. That's what one has to do when one is an actor. You go where the work is. But every time I finished up a job, if I wasn't going to a regular job, another acting job, I would come back to social work. So I had to take that ego and really rein it in. I had to pull it in to the point where I realized and was comfortable with the fact that wasn't about me. It was about this individual who was homeless. I worked with homeless individuals. It was about this individual who was on crack cocaine. It was about this individual who had been an alcoholic for 50 years and hasn't had a drink in 12 years. It was about this individual who had severe mental illness and thought that he or she was Jesus or God. So I really had to pull it back. But I always used to say to other actors, I said, well, at least I'm not waiting tables. There's always something I could feel really good about. But then when I went off somewhere for 7, 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 12 weeks to work somewhere, say it was a repertory theater or regional theater or to do Shakespeare at a Shakespeare theater, I became that actor again. So I felt like this incredible facility, not only within the theater, because within the theater you're playing different roles, but within my two vocations. I had to stretch myself and be very flexible. And as a result, I have found myself after 61 years, I'm 61, that I am comfortable in so many different places. I did a little sidetrack for a couple of years. In about 7 or 8 years ago, I decided, you know what? I don't want to move 120 more times in the next 20 years as an actor. I don't want to do social work anymore. So I went off and studied cardiac ultrasound. I became a ultrasonographer, and I moved back to the West Coast because I did my training in Cleveland, which was close to my parents. So I wanted the program was close to my folks because they were needing my assistance more and more. And so I went out to Arizona, and I get fired from my job after 5 months because I couldn't see the screen anymore. If someone does cardiac sonography, it's best that one has young eyes. I've been wearing glasses since I was 5, and I never really took that into account, but I was having a hard time seeing the screen. And when it comes to doing an analysis, a sonographic analysis on someone's heart, that cardiologist who looks at that ultrasound, they want to know that it's precise, and I was having a hard time doing it, and I actually got fired from the job. So I came back here and literally felt like I was starting over. I got a lot of support at Mount Lebanon United Methodist Church, which is a church that my grandmother about 25, 30 years ago chose over all the others along Washington Road. She went to each and every one, and she said, this is the place where the people are the friendliest. So my family followed. When I say my family, I mean all the women in the family and myself. The men did not attend. My father didn't need to attend. So I really enjoy my place there. I really enjoy the interactions I've had there. And it was almost like I was looking for some other deeply spiritual thing, which for me, social work is, as well as acting. Because you are conjuring something that people can't see. You can't see. It's dwelling in the unknown, which I'm really comfortable doing. So, about 3 or 4 years ago, I spent some time talking to George Bayshore. Spent a lot of time talking to George, and I thank Carolyn very much for her Sprites and her iced teas that she used to bring in. While George and I were involved in these marathon talking sessions. And he says, you know, you're really reflective. I says, yeah, that's one thing I do really well, George. I'm really reflective. I can reflect all day on things. And so I realized just how much I appreciated that one-to-one interaction. And we just developed this relationship that was really wonderful. And he was a man. Up until that time, I hadn't developed strong relationships and strong friendships, or had family members who were males who felt that a deep calling and a deep love for Christ in their life. So about 3 years ago, I started classes at United Theological Seminary. It's in Dayton, Ohio. I spend maybe 1 week a year out there. And actually, because of the pandemic, this is one summer where I did not spend a year out there because things are pretty bad still in Dayton, Ohio. And so the only classes I've taken are spiritual formation classes. And a lot of the other stuff I haven't taken. In the last year and a half, I know that I spoke with the men's group over in the church across the street, the Presbyterian church, during one of our big men's groups. And at that time, I was pursuing the Master's of Divinity. I'm no longer pursuing the Master's of Divinity. I'm doing a general Master's of Arts. I've always been kind of a generalist. I want to pick and choose from here and there. I'm now in a program which I basically drive the ship. I decide what I want to do, and there's only one class that's required. So I'm no longer on the MDiv track. And at this point, I feel as if because of what happened to me as a stenographer, what I learned there was that I'm trying to master a vocation that requires real visual acuity, but it really hit me hard when I realized that I've always been one that sees and feels with heart. And that's very important to me. And it's not so much with the eyes. And because of the imagination that one develops as an actor, one is developing the heart and the soul and the spirit. So I started actually with Scott, our local licensed pastor, who preached last week. Thank you very much, Scott. And it was wonderful. And I don't know if I'm going to pursue that local pastor route or not. I feel as if what God is calling me towards is perhaps a hospital chaplaincy. I've been having very intense conversations with people for about 40, 45 years, since I was very young. And it's kind of ironic that as an actor, you're performing for hundreds of people, sometimes over 1,000 people in a very large amphitheater space. But I think because of that, or maybe in spite of that, I really enjoy conversations that are one-to-one, which is why this pandemic has really hit hard for me and my other family members who are very similar, my mom in particular. I can't think of anything more wonderful than to sit down with somebody and ask them 100 questions. I want to get to know them. I'm just very inquisitive, sometimes to the point of people are a little bit uncomfortable. I want to know who they are. But at the same time, I want to tell them who I am too. So there are certificate programs that are available in large hospitals throughout the country. That's something I'm exploring now, and it's usually a paid internship. And this one I'm looking at is potentially Chicago. If I pursue it, it wouldn't be until next year. Yes, with the pandemic being what it is, I don't think now would be a very good time to pursue something like that. So I'm leaving a lot of my options open. And so it's, and I think something Tom said during his sermon 2 weeks ago, I'm paraphrasing here, he took it from Psalm 46. He said, be still, and I think it's, and know that I am God. I think it's, and I have kind of crafted that for my own utilization, my own purposes. And for me, it's be still and know that God is near. So I'm very much on a path, as much as I am, as much as I was 40 years ago, in terms of what does God want me to do? Where am I being led? And my spiritual practices have just really expanded since starting in the seminary. I meditate every morning. Of course, I'm a hiker. I mean, I share some of my deepest thoughts and deepest, my most incredible friendship with God is out there. It's like, we're here. I'm a yoga practitioner. I exercise, I walk, and I meditate in the morning. And be still and know that God is near is something that I speak before I have that time of communion with the Holy Spirit in the morning. Am I taking this where you want it to go, John? Am I answering all your questions along the way? What would you like to ask me?
You've answered everything that I had to say. I had to ask you, David. You did a great job.
I know.
And so unless you have anything to add, I would just like to say I appreciate the role that Mount Lebanon Church had in your call to the ministry, as well as a particular mentor of Bishop George Bayshore. In the stories that we hear from others in this program, mentorship and closeness with those who walk in the faith are important. And it's something that all those who are listening as church members should know, that whether formally or informally, we are mentoring those who are considering the ministry. And so we need to be cognizant of that. And I appreciate everything you had to say, and it's a wonderful story. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think, we're living in a time where we are being forced to curtail our activities in a certain way. At the same time, it presents an opening. It's something we can learn from, we can step into. It might be really scary, and it is. And it's incredibly scary and frightening. And I can feel that push and pull in my life. I feel alone sometimes, but place. There is a place, a very comfortable place, and that's, you know, walking with Christ, walking in the shoes of Jesus. It's available all the time, and that's something that's really helped me this period of this pandemic.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your words of inspiration, Dave, and we all wish you well, and we'll pray for you as you discern what is your future in the ministry. So thank you.
Thank you, John.